Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members of the board, Mr. Stewart, town building official, and Ninette. And thank you for joining us today. And well, welcome to the Building and Fire Board of Appeals meeting of September 19, 2012. And we may begin by a roll call, please.
Board Member Mardian.
Here.
Board Member Wu.
Here.
Board Member Tatuyan.
Here.
Board Member Chekmejian.
Here.
Chairman Keshishian.
Here. Presentation, comments, oral communication.
Let's go through the agenda just for the record. Ninette, can you read item 2 into the record?
Chairman Keshishian, Agenda Item 2, Presentations and Commendations.
Well, today we have none.
Very good. Next.
Next item is oral communication.
Today we have no speakers.
Okay. I guess the next item will be the approval of the minutes of December 15 and
2010.
December 15, 2010, exactly.
Correct. Thank you. Chairman Keshishian, members of the board, today at item number 4 on the agenda, we have 2 items, as you have acknowledged at agenda item 4A. We have approval of the minutes of the December 15, 2010 meeting. You may recall that this particular item was on the agenda for approval of minutes at our last meeting, but by virtue of the fact that we had insufficient members present who had been present on that particular date for our previous public meeting on December 15, 2010, this item was carried over until today. Since we do have all members of the board present today, we can act on this. And just as a reminder, board members Wu and Mardian were not part of the board at that time, okay. And so really approval is relegated to the remaining board members. And so with that, I believe that there's been ample opportunity to review the minutes. If there are any corrections, of course, we'd be happy to note them. Otherwise, a motion second and a roll call for approval of those minutes would certainly be appropriate.
Okay, thank you. We have a motion to approve the minutes of December 15, 2010.
I'd like to make a motion to approve.
I give a second.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Board Member Mardian.
Abstain.
Board Member Wu.
Abstain.
Board Member Tatuyan.
Yes.
Board Member Chekmejian.
Yes.
Chairman Keshishian.
Yes.
Thank you. Next at item 4B, we have a similar item. We have approval of the minutes from our last meeting, which was just last month, August 15, 2012. At that particular meeting, we had 4 members present. Board member Chekmejian was not present, so the other 4 members will be acting upon this.
Okay, thank you. So may I have a motion to approve the minutes of August 15, 2012 meeting, please?
I'll make a motion to approve August 15 minutes.
Here, a second.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you. A roll call, please.
Board Member Mardian.
Yes.
Board Member Wu.
Yes.
Board Member Tatuyan.
Yes.
Board Member Chekmejian.
Abstain.
Chairman Keshishian.
Yes, thank you.
This takes us to agenda item 5. Ninette, can you read agenda item 5 into the record?
Chairman Keshishian, Agenda Item 5, Old Business. Today we have none.
Thank you.
That takes us to the business at hand today. Ninette, can you read item 6 on the agenda into the record?
Chairman Keshishian, Item 6, New Business, Case Number BMOD 1228068 2284 Honolulu Avenue. At item 5A, request for an exemption from providing accessibility parking space on a parcel that is improved with an existing one-story commercial building with 5 existing legal non-conforming parking space. At this time, I will turn it over to our building official, Stuart Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Kashishi and members of the board, before us under item 6A, we do have a matter of new business. For those of you who have experienced this before, this is what we refer to as a ratification hearing. It is a public hearing, but unlike a public hearing in which an appellant is seeking some discretionary action by this board regarding an alternative means or method of construction under the building code, this particular public hearing revolves around a disabled access item. In this particular case, and I'll go through the staff report in just a moment, but in this particular case, as the building official, I have already acted upon a request by the applicants, and I have granted an approval for a particular exemption. Because this deals with a disabled access requirement under the code, this is special, and an exemption does not become effective until it is ratified by a duly appointed board. And you, of course, are the appointed board that oversees actions taken by Building and Safety. So to that end, what I would like to do is I would like to draw your attention to the second tab in your packet, and you will find staff report. During my presentation, I will also refer occasionally to the PowerPoint presentation on the screen that will help make my presentation a little bit clearer. Also with us today, should you choose to hear from the applicants, we do have the architect for this particular case, Mr. Jeff Rabbit of Architects Orange. While I think that my presentation will be sufficiently thorough for you to understand what the issues are and the justification for my action of approval, if you do have any further questions that I am unable to address, Mr. Rabbit will be happy to do so.
Thank you.
So with that, let me go ahead and draw your attention to the staff report. I'll actually read through the staff report verbatim because it is rather short and it's very, very straightforward with respect to what is being sought here. And then we'll follow up by me drawing your attention to the PowerPoint presentation where I will show you the site plan, the configuration of the existing parking spaces, and show you some photographs which explain why a particular waiver is being sought. With that, what we have here is case number BMOD 1228068, located at 2284 Honolulu Avenue. The request is for an exemption from providing an accessible parking space on a parcel that is improved with an existing one-story commercial building with 5 existing legal non-conforming parking spaces. As I previously stated, the purpose of this hearing is to ratify the building official's determination to grant an exemption from providing an accessible parking space on a parcel that is improved with an existing one-story commercial building, or, should you so choose, to overturn the building official's determination pursuant to Section 113.1 of Volume A of the Glendale Building and Safety Code. Of course, if you were to overturn my approval rather than ratify it, that would effectively deny the applicant's request. Okay. General information, the applicant before us is Ms. Candace Doyle, who is also in the audience with us, representing Architects Orange, an architectural firm located at 144 North Orange Street, Orange, California, 92866. Discussion. The project involves the remodel, in other words, a tenant improvement, of a portion of an existing one-story commercial building to convert a previously existing retail space to a new Starbucks retail coffee site. The parcel is presently improved with 5 legal non-conforming parking spaces, which at this time are not readily adaptable for use as accessible parking spaces due to an excessive ground surface slope. The project site is located on a relatively steep street, and the project area is limited to a very small region of the lot that is bounded by the subject building on one side and a public alley on the other side. Adjustment of the ground surface slope represents a physical hardship because the surface elevation adjacent to the public alley cannot be modified. Therefore, it would be necessary to excavate the existing slope in a manner that would undermine the foundation of the existing building. Due to the limited dimensions of the parking area, there is insufficient room for a retaining wall. Undermining the building foundation would create a hazardous condition. Officially, the request before myself and therefore you as a board is to permit an exemption from providing an accessible parking space in conjunction with the remodel of an existing one-story commercial building located on a parcel having 5 legal non-conforming spaces. In the staff report, what I did was I presented to you the pertinent sections within Chapter 11 of the Building Code. But rather than read through them, I'll just go ahead and summarize them for you. Okay. In effect, for an existing building that presently does not have accessible parking, when certain alterations are done, it may trigger the need to alter or retrofit existing parking to bring them up to contemporary standards to make them accessible. That's generally the reason why, even for existing buildings, over time, as they are remodeled and as tenant improvements are made to those buildings, eventually you see the handicap or disabled access parking stalls with the blue striped unloading areas gradually added to even existing projects throughout the state of California. The dilemma in this particular case is that in order to do that, a disabled access parking stall and the unloading area is limited to a maximum slope of 2%. Under the code, they are required to be what's considered to be level. And under the code, the legal definition of level is a surface that has a slope of 2% or less. In this particular case, as we will see, the area, the limited area for which the existing non-conforming parking spaces are present is actually fairly steep, far in excess of 2%. As I mentioned before, in order to bring it into compliance, it would involve some type of grading. Since the parking area is bounded to the south by a public alley, the elevation is controlled at that point. The alley cannot be lowered, and the surface of the parking space cannot be adjusted or raised. Likewise, at the northern side of the parking area, that is bounded by the building itself. So therefore, to flatten the surface to bring it into compliance with the 2% maximum slope would require excavation and possibly construction of a retaining wall. As we will see when I draw your attention to the photographs, there just simply is not existing room for a retaining wall. And furthermore, to excavate that site without constructing a retaining wall would completely undermine the foundation of that building, which would constitute a hazardous condition. This is fairly typical of existing buildings that were constructed prior to the establishment of disabled access regulations throughout the state of California. And from time to time, when it is necessary to grant an exemption, a physical hardship is one of the legal reasons which justifies a waiver. That is what is before us today. In terms of the justification for this action, let me go ahead and read it into the record, because should you choose to ratify my decision of approval, it is incumbent upon you to justify your action. Should you wish to rely upon the same justification that I did, you can simply indicate that the justification is as stated in item E of the staff report. Justification. The project site is located on a parcel that is currently improved with a very small existing parking area. Building and safety staff has concluded that a physical hardship exists because it would be necessary to undermine the existing building's foundation in order to establish a compliant, accessible parking space. There is insufficient room on the sloped property to enable the site to be regraded in order to establish an accessible parking space with a surface slope that does not exceed 2%, as required under Section 1129B.3, paren 4. Undermining the building foundation would create a hazardous condition, and it would compromise the safe use and occupancy of the building. An exemption is justified due to the aforementioned physical hardship. My recommendation is to ratify the building official's determination to grant an exemption from providing an accessible parking space on a parcel that is improved with an existing one-story commercial building with 5 existing legal non-conforming parking spaces. Before I move on to the PowerPoint presentation, I do want to point out that at the conclusion of that presentation, should the board feel so justified to make a motion and second to move in that direction, a motion is prepared for you at item 5A1, and the maker of the motion would be able to simply read that into the record, should you so choose. And with that, if I could draw your attention to the screen, I'll quickly walk through just a few slides. On the first screen, what we have is a pair of drawings. In the upper left, there is a site plan which actually shows the property location. It is in the Montrose area, right on the corner of Honolulu and Ocean View Boulevard. In this particular case, the north arrow would be pointing directly to the left. So this particular property, to familiarize yourself with the location, is located at the, the southeast corner of the intersection of Ocean View and Honolulu. And I'll show a blow-up of that in just a moment. To the middle of the screen, you'll see an enlarged plan, which does have some site elevations, and they will really demonstrate exactly how steep this parcel is, certainly in excess of the 2%. Okay, as I mentioned, here is a blow-up of the site where the Starbucks is being developed. It is, as I mentioned, at the corner of Honolulu Avenue and Ocean Boulevard. What I would like to do is point out that the hatched portion of the existing building is the proposed location of the new Starbucks coffee site. And just to the south of that, there is a separate tenant in the building on that property, which is presently occupied by a surf shop. That particular business is still located there. Jointly, the tenants of the improvements on that property share the parking lot that is located just south of the surf shop, right at the intersection of Ocean View Boulevard and the alley. And here's a blow-up of that particular area. Shows the location of those 5 parking spaces, shows the alley, the width of the alley, and the slope. For those that are familiar with this particular portion of the Montrose area, you do know that Ocean View does slope downward from north to south. That is reflected by the slopes, or grades, if you will, of the parking lot, of the sidewalk, and then also of the alley. As you'll note, all of the arrows point to the right because the entire site, the street, and the alley does have a cross slope, which does fall from left to right in this particular view, but from a cardinal standpoint, that would be from north to south. You'll notice that in the parking lot area, the slope falls from north to south for varying degrees, anywhere from 4.2% to 2.6%, and in some areas might be slightly more level than that, but in all cases steeper than the maximum 2% that would be permissible under the code. What is most important to note is that the parking lot is actually steepest right at the interface of that corner and the sidewalk along Ocean View, where the slope gradient is reported by the applicant as 4.2%. To put it into perspective, if you take a look at the elevation that the applicant has noted in the exhibit, there's a little circle right in this area here, identified C, and you'll notice that the sidewalk at that location slopes from north to south at a gradient of 6.4%. And then in addition to that, there's a cross slope of that sidewalk towards the street for drainage purposes of 3.7%. That in combination with the fact that the site itself has a slope from north to south of 4.2 will give you an idea that the actual maximum slope, which is oriented somewhat in this direction right over here, does exceed that 4.2%, which is double or greater than the maximum 2% permissible under the code. If I take you on to take a look at some pictures, this will give you an idea of how tight that particular parking space is. Whereas some people might argue that, well, a truck's kind of a large vehicle and that SUV might be a large vehicle. I actually went to that site when there were no cars located there. It's a very, very tight existing parking lot. This interface right here is the property line. In fact, you can see that it coincides with the exterior face of not only this building but other buildings along that particular line. And we'll take another view down the alley to give you an idea. But you can see even from this picture that this particular site is it's not flat, it's not level, which is required under the code for a parking stall to be considered accessible. And in order to flatten it, since it is not physically possible to raise grade at this level, because there is a fixed elevation condition due to the alley, it would require that the grade be lowered at this point, which would result in an elevation discontinuity at the sidewalk, so some steps or something else of that nature would need to be constructed here to prevent a falling hazard. But what's most significant is to lower grade at this point to get this particular parking surface within 2% would require the entire foundation of this building to be undermined. Here's a closer view, and you can see exactly how steep this particular parking lot is, and you can imagine what it would take to excavate this site and bring it to within 2% or flatter gradient. Here is a view of the alley, and as you can see, as I stated before, this is the property line. This is the southernmost extent of all of the adjoining properties and the commercial buildings. This is a direct view of something which is very revealing that had to be performed in order to deal with some plumbing for the Starbucks tenant improvement. And in this particular area over here, you can see that some of the asphalt paving, you can see the pavement interface right here, was removed in order to do some plumbing work over here. And this next picture will give you an idea of what you find here. And this is the foundation for the surf shop building. So even to excavate, to do some plumbing work over there already got to the point where it was removing some soil support of that foundation, and to dig even deeper to flatten this parking area out would be considered to be a physical hardship. So with that concludes the presentation. If you have any further questions, I would certainly be happy to address them. If you would like the applicant to give you a brief description of the project, as I mentioned, Mr. Jeff Rabbit from Architects Orange is present in the audience today. But as you can see, my recommendation of approval is based on an actual legal physical hardship. And should you choose to ratify my approval, item 6A1 is a motion that has been prepared for your use. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I have a few questions. Can we have a discussion before we make a motion, Mr.
Of course.
All right.
Actually, I take it back. What you need to do is, because this is a public hearing, hear from the applicant should you choose to, then close the public hearing, and then once the public hearing is closed, you can have all the discussion that you would like.
But can I ask questions before that?
Certainly.
All right. Mr. Chair?
Please.
How did this issue come about? Because I visited the site and the business is already operating. Wouldn't have this issue come up during plan check?
Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Marty, and members of the board, this item did come up during plan check, and it is an item that the applicants have been resolving. That is why they submitted the request for exemption. The reason that they are actually open for business right now is that they requested a temporary certificate of occupancy, and they're operating under a TCO right now.
But there was an issue at that time at plan check.
Yes, there was.
The reason I'm questioning it because this went through a substantial tenant improvement, as you mentioned, and there were a lot of electrical services done, major installations, and a fence wall there. They actually had a little more room before. So I'm thinking, are we here to discuss an afterthought?
Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Mardian, no, I would not consider this an afterthought. We are aware of the equipment that was constructed or installed at the easternmost site of this parking lot. Regardless, this particular parking area is too steep, and it just would not be possible to grade it flat.
Okay. Now, when I was there, that area on the east seemed flatter. Now, is that something that we could consider? Or is the only spot you're talking about where that pedestrian ramp is and the sidewalk is?
Unfortunately, that would not, and perhaps this provides clarity to your previous questions, unfortunately, that would not be a suitable location because an accessible parking stall is required to be the closest, most direct to the primary entrance of the building, and furthermore, a disabled individual is not allowed to wheel behind the back of parking stalls. And so the area that you're referring to would actually require a handicapped individual in a wheelchair to wheel behind every single parked car, which the state considers to be hazardous. So the most direct, closest to the primary entrance of that structure is actually the space which is right adjacent to the sidewalk.
So in reality, if the board approved this, this building will never have a conforming parking space for a long time to come in this particular case.
In this particular case, like many buildings that were built before disabled access regulations were adopted in California, this particular site won't have a truly conforming disabled access stall until the building is demolished and the site is completely regraded in a manner which creates a level pad.
Because I'm going back to what you mentioned earlier, that's throughout the state, somewhere along the way, these buildings have to conform. Previously, you stated that eventually these buildings will be adaptable.
Oh, perhaps you misunderstood. Over time, with every alteration or tenant improvement, it is required that the building be brought into gradual compliance with contemporary standards. The objective is that eventually, one day, there are no buildings with physical barriers remaining throughout the state of California. However, that being said, Chapter 11 does have a provision in it which indicates that there is a very specific particular exemption that does apply when there is a physical hardship. A monetary hardship, for example, would never apply. It doesn't matter how much it costs to make a project comply, you have to do it. But if there is a physical hardship, because there is a condition which cannot be physically overcome, such as the undermining of a foundation, that constitutes a physical hardship.
Thank you very much, Mr. John. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I have a question.
Sure.
Mr. Tom, page number 2 of the exhibit
Yes.
is the site plan. And the way that I see it is the property lines, there's PLs. Am I to understand that there are 3 buildings on one lot there?
3 businesses.
Or 3 buildings on one lot, or is... How is the legal lot lines here?
For the benefit of the viewing audience, on our screen is the exhibit that Board Member Tertullian is referring to. And to answer your question, this particular site certainly does have 3 distinct commercial spaces. Whether or not they were constructed as a single building or separate buildings is actually kind of irrelevant. Based on the configuration and their appearance, I would suspect that they were built at different times. The key point here is that all of those structures reside on that same parcel. The manner in which the disabled access standards apply in the state of California is that if there is any on-site parking for a particular site, and the code itself, Chapter 11, does not differentiate whether or not through a lease agreement, for example, those parking spaces belong to either Color Me Mine or Starbucks or the surf shop. Those are merely on-site parking spaces for commercially developed property. It therefore triggers the need for on-site accessible parking. As I mentioned, based on looking at the buildings, their appearance, I would surmise that these 3 areas were built at different times.
Any other questions from the board members?
No, I do have one more question, Mr. Chair. If the board approves this, does the city have any, or is there any legal ramification on the city for granting this? The reason I'm questioning that because there has been several cases where, although there's an existing building and it's been there for several years, 50 or 80 years, there is disabled or disabled handicapped people who are, cannot use the facility, and they have brought this to a legal matter or a legal issue. And I've recently heard 2 cases that technically they're, suing the owners for having a building that doesn't have accessible parking, restrooms, and things like that.
Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Marty, and members of the board, that's a very, very insightful question, and let me explain. What you are referring to is an area of accessibility which crosses beyond state Title 24 compliance, which is what we and all local jurisdictions enforce, and the federal ADA standard. Just to jump to your question, does the city incur any risk or liability? The answer is no. What we are enforcing here, and the only thing that is before us today, is related to the accessibility standards under California State Title 24 regulations. And within those regulations, there is an express provision which allows for consideration of physical hardships. In terms of whether or not, as you proposed, a physically challenged individual feels that they've been deprived an opportunity to, say, buy a cup of coffee at Starbucks because there was no place for them to park. This action here and a ratification by this board on behalf of the City of Glendale has nothing to do with Starbucks' legal obligation to comply with any federal standard. ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which entitles everybody, including disabled individuals, to the same equal opportunities, because ADA is a civil rights act, will always still be there. So we are not acting or interpreting or opining on whether or not Starbucks is meeting their responsibilities under ADA. That is Starbucks' sole responsibility. And if it turns out that they are doing something which is in violation of ADA, in other words, it's in violation of a federal statute, any individual who is wronged would have recourse through the federal statute, but that's not enforced through the city or through the building department. ADA is enforced through the Department of Justice, the DOJ. If an individual was deprived of certain rights or privileges because of an action or an inaction by an entity such as Starbucks, that individual would certainly have every opportunity to take an action up with DOJ.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a quick question, Mr. Tom, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I know this area very well. I live not too far from here. Prior to Starbucks tenancy at the location, wasn't Color Me Mine at that location, or was, I believe it was there, and then they moved over to vacate that premises so Starbucks could come in. But I know that Color Me Mine was not there, and the reason why I'm asking is I'm just kind of curious as to why when Color Me Mine had moved into that particular location where Starbucks is located today, why this parking physical hardship was never an issue, and now all of a sudden when Starbucks is occupying this location, why this is becoming an issue.
Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Wu, members of the board. I'm going to address this in two parts. Part number one, I'm actually going to answer your question the best I can, but part number two, I'm going to defer to the appellants because I'm not completely familiar with what tenant movements from one to another have been performed over time. I certainly see why Starbucks would want a corner space, and if something was done in order to allow them to build out that space, they would probably know better than I would. But this is the applicant's exhibit, and if they are indicating that that's where the Starbucks tenant improvement and build out is, I think that they probably know that better than I do. But with respect to the first part, what it comes down to is it comes down to how Chapter 11 works. For all new construction, the entire project would be required to comply with Title 24 Disabled Access Standards. Whenever there is existing construction, there is a trigger. And what ends up happening is if the valuation of the work that is being performed or proposed is less than a particular threshold amount, which I believe the threshold amount this year is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $130,000. If the total scope of work within any existing building is less than that threshold for any 3-year contiguous period of time, then they are limited, or they're required only to expend 20% of the valuation of their work towards bringing the property into compliance with those standards. And furthermore, there's a checklist which dictates the order in which they are required to expend that money. So to get to your question, if there had been a tenant improvement, such as for the Color Me Mine commercial space, and if the extent of their work was much less extensive than what it takes to put in a commercial food establishment or coffee shop, some walls or some other things, if the valuation of the work was sufficiently low, then by the time you expend just 20% of even a smaller amount towards disabled access features, you might not even get down to where on that checklist the disabled access parking is, because the order of expenditure is actually dictated by the code.
Because, like I said, I mean, I know that previously it was occupied as to be a bookstore once upon a time,
Okay.
and they moved out, and Color Me Mine came in, and then they relocated to the next adjacent suite, and the Starbucks came in. So I'm just kind of curious as to why when Color Me Mine came in to occupy that space when it was previously a bookstore, and then they occupied it, never was an issue with this parking in Starbucks.
That would have to do, as I mentioned, the sequence by which non-compliant features are required to be upgraded or brought into compliance with today's standards is stipulated in Chapter 11 of the code. For example, the very first item, and this, by the way, actually kind of makes sense, the very first item is providing an accessible entrance. It doesn't seem to make any sense to make a site accessible if a physically challenged person can't even get through the front door to conduct business. And so therefore the code has a very logical order in which that 20% expenditure is mandated to be spent. if the valuation of the tenant improvement job to move Color Me Mine was sufficiently small that 20% constituted only a couple $1,000s, that would far be exceeded by putting a brand new accessible entrance with the proper hardware, proper landings, proper door swing, proper door strike, push doors, and so forth.
Thank you.
So with that understanding, Mr. Tom, is that to say that the Starbucks location, the main entry at the corner, that is accessible for disabled access, even though the sidewalk slope is considerably more than, as you mentioned, more than the 2% required by code, but the building still has an accessible entrance from the corner. Is that correct? All right. Just for clarification, I mean, this has nothing to do with disabled access, but when I'm looking at this plot plan and the pictures where the cars are parked, it appears to me, and perhaps this is a question for the architect, it appears to me there's another potential for add another parking space not right next to the corner of sidewalk on the alley, and it appears to me there's a car parked there right now. But is the parking lot striped as it is on this exhibit right now? Only 5 parking spaces?
Chairman Kashishian, I would defer to the applicant.
Yes.
And when you're done asking questions of me, the applicant is here and can certainly address those.
Chairman Kashishian, they just restriped it and new asphalt was just put in, so I didn't count how many numbers, but there is striping.
So there are 5 parking spaces, not 6?
I didn't count the numbers, but I know the surface has been resurfaced and there's striping there.
Okay. Are there any more questions from the board members?
Maybe the architect could answer that question, perhaps.
If you could start by stating your name and your affiliation.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, board members, Mr. Tom. My name is Jeff Rabbit. I'm with Architects Orange. We work hand in hand with Starbucks as their consultant, and we are the architect of record for this particular remodel, or actually new store. I want to start off by thanking you for the very descriptive presentation and your recommendation for approval. I just would like to, for the record, state that Starbucks takes it very serious. Accessibility is very important to them. Accommodations to not only their customers but their own employees. Prior to the permit submittal and approval of this particular remodel, Starbucks did apply for and get approved for 14 off-site parking stalls, which does include accessible parking stalls, and it's a shared parking field that is not too unusual in these types of areas. So most of the cities, or most of the stores, and I can't state for fact, but typically they all apply for similar things, where they're using city lots basically to accommodate their own needs. These particular 5 stalls are not used by Starbucks, patrons, or employees. This issue has come up just simply because they exist on the internal parcel that Starbucks is existing on. So, as I stated before, we as architect of record are charged with making sure that Starbucks is in compliance. We've, over the last 2 years, have done 200 stores and remodels for Starbucks, and this is the first time that we've ever had to submit something for a deviation from what the typical ADA code would state. So this is an unusual territory for us and for Starbucks. And there's some concerns with that area back there. We have looked at it in 10 different ways to figure out how to accommodate it, and beyond the description that Mr. Tom has given you based on the actual area within our boundary, there's additional constraints. If we were to grade that area and make it 2% or less, there is still not the path of travel, which is all part of the component to making it an area completely accessible. So even if we did find accessibility space in the back, even looking at it in a parallel sense to the alley, we still would not be able to accommodate a handicapped person from that space to the front door Starbucks. That was part of the original concept of making sure that we were accommodating for the customers and employees with the street surface parking out in front all along Honolulu, Honolulu. And also to point out that the interior of Starbucks is 100% compliant. As you had pointed out, the front entrance is absolutely in compliance. Toilet rooms, there's 2, fully compliant, as well as all of the typical complying seating for per code. I think you had some questions for me. If you wanted to be specific, I can jump into those.
Sure. Thank you for the explanation. Would you mind telling the board where those 14 off-site parking spaces are, if you don't mind?
Without the document, there's actually in the application, what we do is we show a certain radius of area, and within that radius area, there are a number of city parking lots that are allowed then to be included in that sort of area of relevance. And so I can't point to 14 stalls and say those are ours, because it is sort of a reciprocal parking, shared parking situation as city parking stalls.
Okay, so those aren't specifically reserved for Starbucks. Those are not covenanted spaces. Those are spaces that are available to any customer.
They are available to all.
I see.
Anybody who's visiting that area.
Correct.
Now, let me ask you a quick follow-up to what the chairman said. Is there any handicapped spaces in those areas? Because I didn't pay attention. Is there any handicapped public parking spaces?
They are, and quite honestly, I'm not sure if that is completely representative of the angled on-street parking. I do know that there's handicap available parking just maybe 2 more stores down and off the presentation. That does serve that entire length of retail space.
So there's public ADA accessible parking there.
Correct. And the sidewalk along Honolulu is accessible, where the sidewalk along Ocean View is not.
Now, looking at that plot plan, would you tell us what that area right at the intersection of the sidewalk and the alley is used for? Is that an extra parking space that possibly can be accommodated, or?
It's an area that, as the grades modify, as the city sidewalk slopes up, and our parking stalls, even though they're sloped, they aren't sloped to the degree of the city sidewalk. So there's some transition areas, some warping of some asphalt, and it sort of warps and ramps up to accommodate the coverage of the adjacent footing for the surf shop.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please.
The way I looked at it over there, it was much flatter than the picture showed. It was that corner that he's talking about, the first stall, is used as a parking stall. It's not just, although you don't call it out on the plan, but it is used as a parking. I was just there over the weekend. Now, according to Mr. Tom, and the hardship that you're asking us is the only way to resolve this problem is underpinning the building to create that flat area.
Correct.
That's the only way you're going to do it. Is that,
well, again,
if worse come to worse?
That would solve possibly a parking stall, but it would certainly not solve the other important component, which would be the path of travel.
Thank you very much.
If I may, Chairman Kashishian, members of the board, in this picture over here, which depicts that area that was just brought into question, this is one of the areas that presents a physical difficulty, because even if it were possible to excavate the ground away, since this space would be the space which would be closest to a primary entrance and have the shortest path of travel, and because you cannot level it by raising the alley, as we saw, already has a cross slope from north to south. Even if it were possible to substantially lower the grade at this point, in order to get from the parking space onto the public right-of-way, as Mr. Rabbit has indicated, trying to get what we refer to as a path of travel would be extremely difficult. The parking space itself is required to have an unloading area, and that unloading area is also limited by statute to a maximum gradient of 2%, which means that the parking stall and an unloading area would have to have a 2% maximum slope, and then, in order to have a compliant path of travel, to get up to the sidewalk would require a ramp, and per code, the maximum gradient of a ramp is limited to 8.33%, or 1 in 12, which would mean that it would take a heck of a ramp to get from that parking space up onto the sidewalk just to get up to Honolulu. I think Mr. Rabbit's point that there are other parking spaces that are really intended for use by the Starbucks customers points out that those parking spaces are probably located in an area which is much more appropriate and more convenient for disabled individuals anyway. As he stated, the only reason that this item is even a technical issue that Building and Safety had to consider and is before you for ratification is by virtue of the sheer fact that these existing parking spaces happen to be located on the same parcel as the Starbucks business. These are not the parking spaces which are technically intended to be used by Starbucks, but they happen to reside on the same parcel. It's a technical issue.
But again, it's part of the building, you know, the building has
Certainly.
parking. You know,
Certainly, that is true.
shared parking. Even if, I mean, I'm just thinking hypothetical, Mr. Tom, even if you put, I'll go back a little bit. Let's say they tear this building down. They provide parking from the back at the alley.
Okay.
We're not going to change the sidewalk. So even if, let's say, they put a parking space there that with van accessible and all that, he still has to come to the sidewalk
No,
and
you
go
can
up.
go from the back. You can
Unless
have
if
an
he has
entrance.
access from the building.
If you're going to build a new building, then you provide access from there.
Yeah, I mean, eventually he's at the sidewalk. I mean, if the issue is the sidewalk being too steep, I mean, you still have to get to the sidewalk.
You don't have to get to the sidewalk if you're building a new building. You can go from the rear entrance.
You know, I don't know. I mean, I've done several cases where, you know, if you're remodeling a building and it needs compliance with ADA, an accessible route has to be provided from the sidewalk to the building. Am I correct, Mr. Tuck?
I'd like to point out one thing. There are really too many variables to even consider or speculate what might be done if this site were demolished and redeveloped, because one very real possibility would be actually in line with what the applicant has already described was granted to Starbucks. If a building was developed which covered the entire site, and they were granted an off-site parking agreement through our zoning section, which is actually why their parking spaces are scattered within a particular radius of the site. If there are no parking spaces on the site, then none needs to comply. So there are clearly legal means by which a new building could be built with zero accessible parking on the site. This particular situation happens to be rather unique because there are existing parking spaces that exist on this parcel that have existed probably since well before the disabled access standards ever took effect in California, and they're too steep, and to try to put a retrofit standard on it right now, it just simply does not fit the terrain of this part of the city.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
With that, if there are any further questions of staff, I'd be happy to address them. If not, now would be a good time to close the public hearing, and if you had any cause to discuss this matter amongst yourselves, you could hold a discussion. Or if you're ready, of course, you could close the public hearing and move on to a motion.
Do we need to close the public hearing? Can we just,
All you need to do is you're the chair. All you need to do is bang the gavel and say, public hearing is hereby closed.
okay, the public hearing is hereby closed. So,
Mr. Chair, if I may ask you or Mr. Stewart, if this board denies it, Is this the last resort? Or can they appeal it to City Council?
They could appeal it to the city council. City council would be presented exactly the same information that you were presented. And my recommendation would not change. I would recommend to the city council that it be approved.
And Mr. Tom, you already mentioned to us that they're operating under temporary certificate of occupancy, and is that a condition of the certificate of occupancy for permanent certificate of occupancy? If this board denies this request, then they're going to void the temporary certificate of occupancy?
Yes.
That's what I'm getting at, Mr. Chair. I asked our building official,
Just trying to clarify. I know
yeah,
that's where you're
how
going.
far, we're kind of a little late in this stage, and we were presented with this case, unfortunately, to make a decision that, the tenant improvement is done, and here we are facing, okay, do you deny this, or you justify it somehow? Because, the establishment is doing business. They're operating. And that's where I'm having a little difficulty, Mr. Chair.
If I may,
Please.
Perhaps more is being read into this. This is not being presented to the board for the purposes of deciding whether or not it's a good idea or a bad idea. It's really to ratify and confirm whether or not you believe a physical hardship exists. If, for example, this was a flat lot, and there were no physical hardships, and they were arguing a physical hardship as a means to obviate the need to provide some expensive feature, that would be certainly one thing. In this particular case, I've presented what I feel to be a pretty clear case. Nonetheless, each of you is of individual mind, and you can vote as you see fit. But I do want to point out that the reason that I made recommendation for the approval is that this appears to fit exactly in line with what the state had in mind for the physical hardship. In fact, the reason that the state regulation has the physical hardship exemption in there is in recognition of the fact that the law simply cannot cover every single situation, and that from time to time there may be a physical condition that is beyond what the code can accommodate. To get to your question regarding what would happen and would the temporary certificate of occupancy be rescinded, and my response, absolutely yes. The applicants are aware of that. They have been informed that this is a correction item. This is the route that they have chosen to address this particular item. And when they applied for a temporary certificate of occupancy, a deadline or an expiration was placed on that just slightly past this public hearing date in recognition that Starbucks' ability to occupy the space would be reliant upon an affirmative ratification hearing.
Well, Mr. Tom, based on the facts presented and looking at the diagrams and physical conditions of the site and whatnot, I think I see that we can justify the decision that was made by you to grant this exception. Because again, even if they were to grade the parking lot in the back and provide 2% slope or handicap parking and whatnot, still there was not a way to go from the parking directly to Starbucks space because there was another space in the middle. They couldn't go from the back door. There's obviously another business in the middle. And they couldn't go back to the sidewalk to get to the space because sidewalk is already over the required slope. So I guess based on that, I think we have enough reasons to approve this modification that's already granted.
Mr. Chairman, if that's your decision, then at this point, what we would do is you would entertain a motion and certainly try one motion, see where it goes. If that doesn't work, you could try an alternate motion. If you are inclined, or if the board is inclined to consider ratification of my action, all it would take would be a motion, a second, and a roll call to test the water in terms of item 6A1, which is, I'll read it, ratification of the building official's exemption from providing an accessible parking space on the subject parcel. And paired with that, if you saw fit, if you felt it appropriate, you could also articulate that your justification of that ratification would be as outlined in the staff report under item E, which is what I read into the record. If you felt that you wanted to justify it on some other basis, you could offer that up for the record as well. But everything that I have presented is already included in justification E. And so with that, I will turn it over to you for an action.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll support your motion, but I want to make sure that there is parking, handicap parking within the vicinity. How could we do that? I understand the difficulties, and you said every word, Mr. Chair, that you have this, you have that, you have this. The applicant stated that the path of travel is an issue. I can probably justify it if we can make sure that there is handicap parking within the vicinity of 500 radius or what.
Understood. Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Mardian, members of the board, there are at least 2 different ways to accomplish what you are proposing. I will go over them, and then I will tell you which one I would recommend.
Okay.
One method would be not to act today, but to hold this matter in abeyance until the next public hearing, which wouldn't take place until the third Wednesday in November, which would give the applicant sufficient time to identify where all of those parking spaces are located that he mentioned are within a particular radius, and he could also survey the site and identify whether or not one or more of them happen to be designated as a handicap accessible space. Or item number 2, and this would be my recommendation because it would not further belabor this point and require reopening and holding another public hearing. If you would like, you may modify the motion to include a condition. In effect, it would be a conditional action. And what I would propose at that point would be that a motion that would be ratification of the building official's exemption from providing an accessible parking space on the subject parcel, subject to the condition that at least one accessible parking space is located within, and you could dictate whatever distance you saw fit. If that motion was made, seconded, and voted upon, what that would in effect do is it would present a ratification with that condition tied. What it would require building and safety to do, or actually what it would require the applicant to do, is to survey the site, locate the accessible parking spaces which may be scattered around alternate parking lots and so forth, and bring that as evidence which would be included into this file as an exhibit later. I will tell you that I am familiar with city lots in the Montrose area, and the city, because they are city-owned lots, are required to have handicap parking, and they do have handicap parking. And so if you really feel that it's that important, that's what you would do. But if you want to trust me as your building official, stating that I'm familiar with those parking lots and do have disabled access parking spaces in our own city parking lots, if you want to forego imposing any further conditions, that would also be fine.
No, I trust you, Mr. Stewart. I mean, I'm not going to delay this process for that particular, just a condition that I wanted to affirm that we have some sort of a handicap parking within the vicinity. I understand the hardships and I understand the building. I bike every weekend there, I know exactly where it is. And I know those areas are steep in some areas. And I don't like to see establishment like that be in a situation like this when there's an existing building. But I still want to satisfy my justification on the hardship that there is handicap parking exists. Now, if I may further, I mean, maybe I'm asking to, can we Google it, or, I mean, see it now?
Board Member Marty and I believe that the applicant has been doing just that.
I did, unfortunately.
The trees are in the way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm happy with the condition as long as the building official verifies that it exists.
I'd be happy to do that. In fact, there's actually a third option, which really wouldn't be a condition. It would be, on your behalf, an informational request. And you don't have to tie it to this action. You could just make a motion for this ratification as presented. But if directed, because at this time, this moment, I am serving as staff to the board, if you follow up by giving me direction to identify one or more disabled access parking spaces within the immediate vicinity and report back to this board at a later date, just for your own comfort, I'd be happy to do that.
That's fine with me.
I don't think we should have any conditions on our.
Just to
But
give you a little
I have
bit.
I have another
Yes.
question too. Is this something that zoning is involved with in terms of assuring this commercial district has appropriate number of parking spots and accessible parking for that area? Have they gone through that process, or is that a process that they would have gone through and then get to the building department? If you can please inform us on that too.
Chairman Kashishian, Board Member Tatulian, the answer to that is in part yes. The Community Development Department zoning and planning section is indeed responsible for all site development and ensuring that appropriate parking is located either on-site or off-site within a reasonable distance. That would actually be the reason why Mr. Rabbit indicated that he was required to provide, I believe he said 14 spaces within some particular radius. That would have been imposed by planning. And they do that not just for this project, but for all development. The second part of your question having to do with disabled access and accessible parking is not administered through zoning. That is done in a different fashion through the building department, and basically the way it works is it identifies parking areas, not necessarily any parking dedicated to a particular business. Under the law, there is a particular ratio of accessible parking spaces that are required for all parking areas. And depending on the size and number of stalls, those parking lots, those parking areas are mandated to have the requisite or more number of accessible parking stalls. Those parking stalls are always required to be located in positions which are closest to the primary entrances to the businesses which they serve, which is why typically if you're observant, you never see accessible parking spaces buried right in the middle of a large expansive parking lot or way off in the far reaches or far corners of that parking lot. They're always the ones that are closest to the individual businesses. And that would be the case for city lots because the city is bound by those same standards. So I would say, to answer your question, yes, CDD, planning/zoning, does ensure that all businesses, including this one, does have appropriate parking based on the nature of that business. And on the accessibility side, by virtue of the fact that those lots are all reviewed and approved by Building and Safety, they do have accessible parking in reasonably appropriate locations.
And that process has been met, and as he stated, they have those 14 spaces. So they've met that.
I can't confirm what process the applicant has gone through, but by his testimony, he has stated that he's done that. And furthermore, I will offer up that this plan has been approved by the Community Development Planning Division. So I have to presume that because they approved it, and that is their charge, that was examined.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a follow-up question? Maybe I'll direct it to the applicant. Did you file for any, can we reopen, ask the applicant, any planning case, conditional use permit?
the public hearing
Yeah, since they're not staff, you would need to reopen the public hearing.
My question is whether there was any planning case, conditional use permit, or any particular process that there was just plan check, went over the counter, or...
I can't answer that. I don't know what planning is.
Because, I'm familiar with the zoning. I mean, if you go in these days and if you're doing a change of use up to a certain square feet, you don't have to provide the parking, to answer my colleague's question. But again, if I've dealt with TIs and I assisted Starbucks years ago, most of the establishments have to go through conditional use permit because they're not classified as fast food anymore. But that's a different, it has nothing to do with our...
That really has nothing to
It
do
has
with what's
nothing.
before us today. That would be a zoning
Okay.
use consideration.
Just for your peace of mind, I could vouch for Mr. Tom. I know the area very well. There's a parking lot, city-owned, north side of that, so I know there's several, if not more than ample handicap parking spaces there, so I think that's more than sufficient. And it's in close proximity. All you have to do is come down the street, cross the street, and you're at Starbucks. So I think that...
Thank you, Board Member Wu. I owe you one.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, I'm very familiar with the neighborhood too. In fact, I go just across the street, Coffee Bean there, and I'm sure every one of you have visited that site. And the fact of the matter is, unfortunately or fortunately, that's a brand new, well, not brand new, but it's a newly constructed structure that has several businesses, has a surface parking lot, and it does have several handicap parking spaces. Now, this area and this business obviously generates a lot of parking. That's why these board members are so concerned. And we're all concerned. Everywhere you want to open a Starbucks or a Coffee Bean, one of those kind of high-traffic generated businesses, this issue will come up. Now, unfortunately, we weren't involved in those discussions. This is all planning. This is all zoning and whatnot. I wish we were involved. Maybe we would have had we had very valuable comments in here from board members. But we are not here, unfortunately, to discuss that. We have to presume, as Mr. Stuart Tom said, that all these conditions and restrictions have probably been taken care of, and the permits are already issued. Apparently, the applicant has provided sufficient parking spaces north of the site. Even though the sidewalk is probably steeper north of the site, but we have to assume maybe they are handicap accessible somehow. They will roll down the sidewalk and come to Starbucks if that need be, or just sneak in and park across the street in Coffee Bean, and there's a ramp that directly will take you to the sidewalk, which is perfectly accessible. So we are very familiar with the neighborhood. Having said all that, I think, again, our job is basically just look at this particular issue, whether the decision made by the building official can ratify the decision made by the building official to grant an exception for disabled access parking on the property, on the premises. If board members have no other questions, I would like to entertain a motion to approve or ratify the decision that the building official has made.
I'll make a motion to ratify the building official's decision, but just I want to add to verification of parking, ADA parking within the vicinity. I'll make that motion. And I agree with Mr. Wu. That area is, there's parking north, south, but you led me to another question, which is even if we have the ADA parking in that middle of the parking lot in the back, they still have to come up through the alley and go through the sidewalk, regardless. So I will still justify my decision as long as there's ADA parking in the vicinity.
Can I make a discussion before there's a second?
Yes, you may. This particular portion of the public hearing is all yours as the board. If any of the board members feel strongly opposed to the additional condition, you can express that that opinion. The correct way of doing it, however, is as follows. First, see if there is a second to the motion as presented. If there is no second to the motion as presented, that motion dies, and the chairman needs to entertain a new motion. That new motion can be entirely different, or it could be very similar. It could be the motion to ratify simply without the condition. If there is a second to the motion, before roll call is taken, the chair may entertain discussion of the motion that's on the floor. And at that time, board members can indicate, I will not be voting in favor, or I will be voting in favor, and if it is tied to the imposition of the condition, that can be articulated at that time. Without getting into whether or not I have a feeling that there's overwhelming support or lack of support for the condition, those would be the two ways of doing it. Certainly, because you've already expressed your opinion, I believe I know where you're coming from, Board Member Tertullian. You would either be able to articulate some concern regarding the condition, or you could simply hope that there is no second and wait for the chair to entertain an alternate motion. Either of those works.
Well, let's see if we can start this over.
There is a
No,
first.
there is a motion that has to be dispensed with. At this time, you need to ask to see if there is a second,
Okay.
or failing a second, you are in a position to ask for an alternate motion. Let me go ahead and, for the record, so that there is some clarity, identify what it is that you are dealing with. At this time, there is a motion by Board Member Mardian for ratification of the building official's exemption from providing an accessible parking space on the subject parcel, subject to the condition that it is verified that an accessible parking stall is located within the immediate vicinity.
Correct.
That is the present motion. And so you need to, see, as the chairman, see if there is a second to move forward.
Is there a second to that motion with that condition?
Seeing no second, that motion dies.
Okay.
At this time, you can seek an alternate motion.
Okay. Is there a motion to ratify the building official's exemption from providing parking and accessible parking space on that Starbucks location without any additional conditions, as stated in this report?
I'll make that motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
I'm sorry, I was taking notes. Who made the motion?
I did.
And the second was Mr. Wu.
Thank you.
Can we have the roll call, please?
Board Member Mardian,
No.
Board Member Wu,
Yes.
Board Member Tertullian,
Yes.
Board Member Chekmekjian,
Yes.
Chairman Keshishian.
Yes. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. That concludes item 6A. Ratification has been granted. You will receive notification of this within probably a week to 10 days. Okay.
Chairman Keshishian, agenda item 7, reports, information only. Today we have one report, item 7A, monthly building and safety report. I will turn it over to our building official.
Thank you.
Chairman Kishishi and members of the board, our last item is actually a very, very quick one. It is our customary monthly report. It's the last tab that you have in front of you, and it's a very, very short and limited report because this is the monthly report that closes out July of 2012. We do work on a fiscal year that commences in July and ends August 31st. June 30th. And so therefore, this represents the very first month of this current fiscal year. There has not been a lot of activity to fill out the report, so therefore there are only a few things I'd like to draw your attention to. On the first page, for monthly income, 2 items of interest. On the left-hand column, under column A, there is an item labeled plan check. And down a little bit further, there is another item that is slightly indented, MEP trade plan check. Those are the two categories where we keep track of revenues that are directly related to our plan check activity. In other words, our plan check fees. I wanted to bring these to your attention because even though this represents only 1 month of activity, you will notice that we've had a significant increase in our plan check revenues. Current year to date, so for that 1 month, under plan check, revenues brought in $156,753 as compared to the same month last year, $104,196. That represents a 50% increase. Under MEP, while the numbers are lower, the relative proportion is what's significant there because mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plan check fees do tend to be much smaller than building plan check fees, but the relative increase tends to give you an idea of how much busier we are. For MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plan checks, closing out July of 2012, our income total was $59,140 compared to the same period last year of only $12,985. Relatively speaking, that represents a 350% increase, and indeed, our MEP plan check activity was quite busy. If you take a look at the total for our income within building and safety, closing out July 2012, that came out to $441,508 compared to $293,413. Once again, that comes out to just about exactly a 50% increase. So we have been busy. The only last thing that I do want to point out is at the bottom of this particular page, our totals. Total income for building and safety when you take out revenues that were collected for other departments or passed through fees came out to, on the bottom line total, $453,505 as opposed to $299,229 last year, this time of the year. Quite a substantial increase. As you are aware, I track what I refer to as my cost recovery ratio, which identifies what percentage of the cost necessary to run building and safety do we recover through our fees. And a cost recovery ratio of 1.0 would indicate that the fees come in are just right to cover our costs. Our cost recovery ratio at this time is 1.174, indicating that we've been busy enough that our revenues have exceeded the actual cost to run the building department. To put that, to make that clear, to show what that cost recovery ratio is tracking, that is a ratio that is comparative of a base cost of $4.6 million to run building and safety over the course of a year, which includes not only my direct costs for salaries, benefits, overtime, office supplies, and so forth. That even includes my portion of the city overall cost allocation to cover such things as my share of the city attorney's office, my share of the personnel department, my share of the city manager's department. It also includes what is referred to as my ISD cost allocation. Our information services department costs a fair amount of money in order to keep the technology, computers, copy machines, telephones, things like that working. And even when I include that cost into my total costs, that's where the $4.6 million basis comes from, and I'm still operating at a cost recovery ratio over 1.0. So I'm quite happy to report that. And with that, things are very busy. They're going well for building and safety, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to address.
What's the fiscal year?
It starts July 1st.
Oh, it starts July. Okay.
Yes, so this report that ends July of 2012 is for the first month of fiscal year.
Mr. Tom, last time you reported that the hours for building and safety were changed,
Yes.
and how is that coming along?
It's actually coming along quite well. Just as a reminder, the public counter hours in which walk-in customers can get walk-up service have been adjusted to 7 a.m. until 12 noon. We are still here until 5 p.m., and so by appointment only for very special needs to visit with an engineer or somebody else, appointments can be made in advance to see them even after 12 o'clock. One department in particular, Fire Prevention Bureau, has extended their hour. Actually, they never adjusted their hours. Their hours have remained from noon until 3, and they're evaluating how that's working. Quite frankly, they've had very, very few customers after the 12 o'clock cutoff hour, and most of our customers are coming in during that period of time. We've actually seen that we have not only the same number of walk-in customers at the PSC that we've had, as has been the trend, we've been serving more customers even during that period of time. We just see them all at the same time of the day rather than scattered out throughout the course of the day. What has that done for the City of Glendale? What it's done is, at no additional cost, we have been able to improve our efficiency, because rather than serving a particular number of customers scattered throughout an entire business day, when we can serve those customers during the first half of the day, still providing the same amount of service, still issuing the same number of permits, yet then consolidating all of that spare time, so to speak, in between customers to one contiguous period of time at the afternoon, our staff has found that they're more productive in that manner, because they don't start something, get interrupted by a customer for 15 minutes, try to resume, and so forth. They reclaim all of that time all in one contiguous block.
They know that they have after 12 o'clock to get to things
Exactly.
that take a little bit longer to, sit down and think about or review, etc.
Exactly. And so that doesn't cost the City of Glendale anything extra, because we're not hiring more people to be available to check plans or meet with architects or answer engineering type questions. They, as you just pointed out, they already know that if they're serving the public counter from 7 a.m., we do open up early, all the way until noon. They take their lunch break from noon till 1. They have 4 hours every day from 1 until 5, uninterrupted, to take care of other business. It's working out very well.
And appointments.
And appointments, yes.
May I follow up with Mr. Chom? How about when you have a backflow on the counter, especially at building and safety, because we have limited time? So if somebody walks in that they possibly cannot be served, would there be support staff to take over, or,
Well, our counter certainly closes at 12 to the extent that we lock our doors, so to speak, but to the extent that we can still accommodate them, we certainly do that. The only day that is actually very difficult for us to do that, because in addition to our hours being adjusted, we just are short-staffed, are Fridays and Mondays because of a flex schedule. Due to statewide mandates for trip reduction, we do have a flexible schedule to reduce the number of trips, which means that we, for the most part, run on a 980 schedule, and when people's day off happens to fall on a Friday, we may have fewer people that day. And so, to some extent, our ability to continue to help people that may have gotten in through the door before 12 o'clock and still serve them may be somewhat limited. But to the extent that we can, if a person has come in within a reasonable period of time, certainly before 12 o'clock, if for some reason there's a rush, we will try to serve them.
But my question was, you cannot see a plan checker, though. You wanted to wait, because you have the board, you have to sign in. So if he gets in, let's say, 10:30 and there's no room available, he's out of luck.
Oh, no, that's not necessarily. Actually, we haven't seen that yet.
Okay. Well, because we have limited time, we're going to run into that, in my opinion,
Tell you what, I will assure this board that in the event that somebody comes in before 12 o'clock and it appears as if, oh boy, we won't be able to serve you before our office hours close, I will make a commitment that we will try to resolve that. If that means bringing out another plan checker to help the customer before 12 o'clock, we've got other plan checkers. Just because we have one plan checker who, for the most part, is dedicated to counter service, and I think that some of you have dealt with him, Mr. Bear.
Right.
We have other plan checkers that also work the counter from time to time as well.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
So does staff also have alternating lunch hours, or is closed at 12 o'clock, 12 to 1?
Chairman Kashishian, that's something that we had to deal with. Part of the issue comes down to what is a reasonable period of time that you can expect a person, a human being, an employee, to work without a break or without lunch. If they get here at 7 a.m. and they work all the way until noon, because that's when our customers come in, that's 5 straight hours. If we were to alternate a lunch hour and say, some of you take your lunch now from 12 to 1, but some of you still wait until 1 to 2, some people would actually be expected to work 6 straight hours without getting a bite to eat. Whether or not that's even healthy for their blood sugar levels, I don't even want to try that. And so as a result, what we do is we try to give attention to the customers, get them all out the door. And if that means that some people need to wait and defer their lunch a little bit and they don't get to take off at 12, staff is working pretty well as a team, and they just really want to provide everybody service. And then when we are able to close the counter, that's when they all have an opportunity to take lunch. And it actually works out very, very well, because if everybody takes lunch at that roughly 12 to 1 hour, then for the most part, they all also happen to be here from 1 till 5. So if they need each other's help or assistance in various activities, they're all there at the same time. What you were referring to, the staggered lunch hour, was actually a bigger problem with our old counter hours, because since we would stay open all the way until 3 o'clock, keep in mind, we haven't been open until 5 o'clock. Our previous hours curtailed our activity with the customers until 3 p.m. anyway. But what we would have to do is nobody can work from 7 until 3 without a break. So every single member of staff, all of them, sometime within that period of time from 7 until 3, took staggered lunch hours so that we would at least have a skeletal staff to help customers that might walk in through the door. That has always presented a problem, because if a customer came in and they needed to go back to someone over at zoning or someone over at building or at fire, and it was their staggered lunch period, they would have to wait a whole hour until they came back. This way, since everybody, we call it our all hands on deck period, from 7 until noon, to the extent that we can, nobody's taking their lunch period at that time. In theory, we have a higher likelihood of the customer being able to see their dedicated staff person.
So is the rest of the city pretty much on the same schedule?
Actually, every single department is aligned with that, so you can get cooperative service from every department except for fire. Fire still has a staggered lunch during that period, and they are keeping their doors open until 3 o'clock. It's resulted in some minor issues, because during that period of time, if somebody takes a staggered lunch and they're not there, the rest of the city happens to be there, but a fire person might not be there. And then also, the Permit Services Center needs to keep its cash registers open, and we can't begin reconciliation of our daily receipts until after 3, just in case somebody from fire happens to come in and need to post payment after 12 o'clock. But fire is very open-minded, and they have indicated that they're going to check to see whether or not sometime in the future they will also be willing to adjust their hours so that they coincide with all of the other departments. My personal opinion is that when all city services are available at the same hours, everything tends to work out much better. And we've been monitoring how many fire prevention customers have been coming in after 12 o'clock, and it's a very, very small number. So if I had a crystal ball and I could pull it out, I would say that within some short period of time, I would speculate that fire prevention will also adjust their hours, but we're going to leave that up to fire to make that decision.
Thank you.
And with that, it would be appropriate to do a motion for adjournment.
I have a motion to adjourn the meeting today.
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Thank you. This meeting is now adjourned.